Exactly. And
So,
I
yeah.
don't think it's any coincidence that the other Black Girl, the setting is a publishing house, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a similar industry that relies on the passion and the love of its workers in order to exploit them in all sorts of ways.
Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room Arts and Culture podcast. If you haven't, please take a second to rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please make sure you're following us on Spotify or Apple. And did you know we have a YouTube channel? Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really means a lot. You can actually see a lot of our video episodes on YouTube. And if you don't want to listen to any ads that are going to happen throughout the episode, even though I love all of our sponsors, of course, you can listen to our ad-free episodes on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And right now, you can get 1 week for free to see all of the ad-free episodes. And all of those episodes are also video episodes. So you can get to watch me, the guest, and you can also listen to all of Mary's True Crime and Academia episodes ad-free. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Here we go. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. You're hearing this in the new year, so happy 2024, which I can't believe time is going by this quickly. We'll be at 2030 before we know it. But don't want to like rush time with everyone. I'm so excited for this conversation because not only is it in the 19th century in the American literature, which, if you don't know, that's what my PhD is in, and I don't always get to talk about my research field, but we're going to, if you're not in 19th century scholarship or you're not in academia, don't worry. There's a lot of pop culture touch points, especially with Black literature and the other Black girl. So without further ado, I'm joined with Dr. Kelly Ross. So if you don't know Kelly, well, you should head to her Rider University page right now, which I'm reading from. Kelly specializes in early and 19th century American literature and African American literature. She has secondary interests in 20th century American literature, detective fiction, poetry, American studies. Her first book, which we're going to dive into today, is called Slavery, Surveillance, and Genre in Antebellum United States Literature. It was just published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Her work has also appeared in the Oxford Handbook of Edgar Allan Poe, Leviathan, Cambridge University Press's American Literature in Transition from 1820 to 1860. And she co-edits with Emron, I should say, Esplin, Poe Studies History, Theory, and Interpretation. She's received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Northern Illinois University Library Special Collections and Archives Department, the Center for the Study of the American South, and the American Antiquarian Society. So without further ado, I know I've said that twice, but I'm so excited to talk with her. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the ITBR.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first, let me start with another podcast that I had the pleasure of listening to when I was working out at the gym. I think I was doing an ab exercise, and I'm like, I need to listen to Kelly's episode on Podcast, which is so aptly named from you know, Poe studies. And Dr. Caleb Dunn um, had you on, and it was such a great conversation. And you had this urgent call to action in it. And I mean, if you want to paraphrase it, you can, but it like really spoke to me in terms of how Edgar Allan Poe studies is their landscape is changing. And it seems like it's not something just Edgar Allan Poe studies related, it's something that is happening even with the modern language associations calls for public humanities and, opening up academia to the general public. So if you want to, explain to everyone listening what your call to action was, I would so greatly appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I've recently been really lucky to become the editor, co-editor, and then in January I'll be the sole editor of Post Studies. And I was saying in the interview with Caleb, that it's really important to me with that work that I uh, reach out to, invite, and try and encourage lots of people who wouldn't necessarily normally see themselves as wanting to read and study Poe and bring their voices into the conversation. So to me, it's very important that we have new perspectives on Poe from a diverse range of people. And that in order for that to happen, we need to move away from the older model of author societies where the purpose of the author society is to admire and revere the author. And instead, I mean, we can still recognize the importance of these authors and the impact they've had on culture without having reverence be our primary mode of interacting with them. And so, I really want to reach out to people who might struggle with Poe and say, I don't see myself as a person who would want to study Poe or write about Poe. And that's exactly the kind of person I think we need studying Poe, because that person's perspective is important. And like you said, it's not just Poe, it's a range of authors. I've been involved with the Melville Society since I was in grad school, and they're doing the same thing. They're really committed to bringing in, especially young scholars. They're incredibly generous with their mentoring programs and their fellowships. Um, and yeah, just sort of moving away from this author model of we're here to revere the great dead author and moving instead to, what brings us together as a community, and how can we bring more and more people into that community. And then, like you said, that is part of the public humanities mission, because we all study literature. Well, I guess not. I shouldn't speak for all of us. I study 19th century literature because I think so many of our current contemporary issues are rooted in the antebellum period. And so it makes sense to go to that period to understand how we got to where we are. And, so for the public humanities part of it, it's important to bring people like Poe and Melville and all these other authors, but not to say, here's the right way of reading them, but instead to say, how do they speak to you in your life? And, like, how do you as a person react to this? And let's, think about what they can teach us about our contemporary moment.
And the public's interest right now, it's so fascinating. They're really registering that antebellum period that you're talking about, but like even the anxieties of the late 19th century, like the Gilded Age. I just finished that, and I thought it had a slow start in the second season, and I was worried that it wasn't going to hit a stride. But once like the opera battle happened in the Gilded Age, and for everyone who's into the Gilded Age, I'm going to have on an Edith Wharton scholar, Sheila Limming, who's been on the podcast before, but she's going to come back and deep dive it. But did you have a chance to see the Gilded Age?
I have not seen it,
Okay.
unfortunately, but I do adore Edith Wharton. So I'm excited to hear your conversation about that.
Oh, great. Well, and I'm thinking of the Gilded Age because like that show or the Fall of the House of Usher series on Netflix. Um, we're gonna dive into the other Black girl, which I think has a lot of anxieties and um contemporary issues that, speak and bring us back to the 19th century. There's this through line, but why do you think the public is so fascinated with these anxieties, whether it be racial, social, gender, sexuality, that these TV shows keep bringing us back to America's tensions?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I not maybe not with the Gilded Age so much what I'm about to say, but with Usher and the other Black girl, and I think a lot of antebellum stories that get retold or get brought to popular culture, it has to do with the Gothic and the American Gothic, because people love the Gothic, right? And it's a popular genre, it's a popular mode. And that in American culture and American literature has always been about race. The
Mm.
Gothic in America has always been tied up with race because of the original sins of America are slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. So as opposed to European Gothic, where it's sort of Catholicism and secret societies. In America, that's at the root of the Gothic genre. And so whenever you have these contemporary adaptations of things um, that have to do with the Gothic, you often are going to go back to the antebellum because that's sort of like the touchstone for that those like when you think about race, you think about the antebellum period, like you trace it back to slavery, right? And so I think that's why the antebellum narratives keep being important and resonating with people.
And I'm not sure if you always see the MLA's LinkedIn updates, but like every time I feel I go on LinkedIn, the MLA has another urgent call for this is why the humanities matter. Like, don't discount
Oh
us.
yeah.
Like, right, even though all these cuts are happening around the country, this is why English departments need to exist. And I'm not trying to belittle those calls for action because they are important. But what's so interesting to me is the public is absorbing arts and culture. Like all of these streaming services, they keep recycling and reinventing these narratives from literature or
Mhm.
classics and dead white male or dead white female authors, a la Edith Wharton. So do you feel that there's like a disconnect in the synapses right now of like the brain circuit between academia and media or public culture at large? Like why is it not connecting? Because I
Mm.
see the connection.
That's a great question. I think the humanities do matter, and as you're saying, they are vibrant, but the funding is going elsewhere, and I think that's what MLA is driving. That's what is driving MLA's calls because, I'm sure you are aware, most of our profession is now adjunct labor, so there's no sort of stable future and no living wage and no benefits. Um, and yeah, we study the humanities because we love it and we're passionate about it. And a lot of people get taken advantage of because of that, because they bring such passion to it. So I think maybe the MLA calls need to recognize what you're saying, which is that of course the humanities matter. Um, but it's a different funding model than the MLA has traditionally seen, and we're all very anxious about that.
Yeah, well, it's like, do you remember that horror? I know you're not a horror movie fanatic like I am, but I'm sure you know that movie When a Stranger Calls.
Yes, I
And
do.
yeah, and she's like, I mean, it was so inventive when it came out, I think in the 70s, but she like answers the call and like doesn't know that the killer's actually in the house and it's like
Right.
the whole whirlwind. And I kind of feel that way with like academia right now is the call is coming from within the house, which is like needing to bring in experts from the outside to like consult and like have this merging of like recognizing the power that academia can learn from media or from other models
Mm,
and not thinking you have to solve the answers from within the house. Um,
yeah, that
and
makes a lot of sense.
yeah, but like even, I have a small business now and like the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, I'm consulting and like I'm trying to bring these worlds together because, whether it be out of necessity, which it is, but also I'm so passionate. um, it is so upsetting to see how someone's passion and creativity can be exploited because you think you're doing this work in good faith. Like, well, I'm so passionate, I have to like spend 70 hours a week because this is what the university demands from me, instead of realizing, oh, I need a work-life balance that's manageable and
Exactly.
like I need to sustain my health.
Exactly. And
So,
I
yeah.
don't think it's any coincidence that the other Black Girl, the setting is a publishing house, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a similar industry that relies on the passion and the love of its workers in order to exploit them in all sorts of ways. But yeah, any job where you're motivated by an intrinsic love for the subject can very easily become exploitative.
Yeah. well, back to dead white male authors. No, trying to get that transition in there. But like I was also hearing, like I've had on those in classics here, and we've had some really interesting conversations that are very similar. I mean, I think any humanities field right now at a university, you know, you're trying to justify, and that's not a negative, because right, I'm sure you hear professors too put down like, well, why do we need to justify the humanities? Like, and when I'm saying justify, it's opening up ways that aren't just traditional, like you need to learn Latin and Greek to study Homer, or like bring
Mhm.
in different interpretations. Emily Wilson, her new Odyssey and Iliad translations, I think are groundbreaking in
Amazing.
that it's a woman who's translated it, which, is shocking to those in the field, which to the outside, they would say, wait, a woman translating ancient literature, how is that so groundbreaking? But it is in academia. But I think like that right there is the crux of the issue is um, why is it so groundbreaking if we're bringing in new ways of seeing even Poe? Like with the work you're doing, you're even bringing in a new term instead of surveillance, it's surveillance, right? Like if you want to explain that, I think it's a ripe way of just even understanding your approach to antebellum literature, which is shifting this terrain.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I find it very useful in a lot of contexts. So surveillance, well, surveillance was a term that was coined by Steve Mann. He's a surveillance theorist. He's a sociologist. And he replaced the French prefix sur above with sous below. So surveillance is watching from below and surveillance is watching from above. And the idea there is that it's in relation to the power dynamic, so the power of the person watching. If it's surveillant, that person has less power than the person they're watching. So, for example, a contemporary instance would be police brutality videos that are being filmed on phones, iPhones, or whatever, by bystanders. The police are agents of the state, they have power. The bystander is, just an anonymous person. They may not, especially if they're a person of color, a marginalized person, they have less power than an agent of the state. They're surveilling this interaction between the police and the person, who's being arrested or beaten. And then when those bystanders release those videos to the public, they're making their surveillance visible and disseminating it. And that is a way of enacting change in the world because it's bringing eyes and attention to actions that may not be seen by people who don't live in neighborhoods that are over policed and over surveilled. And so it's making people aware of this problem, but it also makes those surveillance vulnerable because they have less power than the government, the police, the media. And when they make their surveillance visible, suddenly they're vulnerable and they get all these death threats and harassment. And, so there's a real cost to being a surveillant that disseminates their spying and they're not, I don't mean spying in a negative way, but they're watching, they're observing.
Would that be similar to like First Amendment auditors? Like sometimes I'll watch on YouTube, like on Long Island, there's this account called Long Island Audit, and he'll go into public like government buildings, and you see time and again, um, the public servants question why he's filming, even though it's within the First Amendment. And like his whole point is to show like we have freedom of speech. And I mean, well, talk about academia, like and surveillance. I mean, it's not in the racial context, but the way that so many academics are being policed right now with their speech. And like, I wonder about the work you do. How do you broach that topic of freedom of speech and how it's being questioned in the university right now?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would say, yeah, probably. I mean, I don't know that account specifically, but if the person running that account, the First Amendment auditor, is a regular citizen and not, affiliated with like a powerful group, then yes, probably that would be surveillance. The interesting thing is something, or for me, sorry, I should say, more an interesting issue is something like oh gosh, I think it's called Turning Point
Oh,
USA.
yes. Yes.
Yeah. Are they surveillance? Because if they're secretly recording professors, there's students in the classroom, which puts them in a less powerful position relative to the teacher, but they're backed up by this very powerful national, well-funded, well-trained organization. And like, let's say they're videotaping an adjunct professor who doesn't have job security, maybe is a person of color and is already marginalized in other ways. Who really has power in that circumstance? Is that a surveillance video? And so that's actually why I think literature is really important to surveillance studies, because whereas Steve Mann, who's a social scientist, he's trying to like diagram all this stuff and say like this is this and this is this. Literature can mess with it, and muddy it and blur it in all these interesting ways. And so I work on racialized surveillance and surveillance in particular, building on Simone Brown's foundational work, Dark Matters, where she defines racialized surveillance and dark surveillance. And literature can, even though in the antebellum period, enslaved people would be surveillance, they're always watching their enslavers, they're surveilling. Literature can imagine these situations where that role gets reversed. Or in the case of Benito Cereno by Melville, there's Babo, who's a Black surveiller, a Black overseer. And so, there's all these ways in which these categories help us to understand things, but they don't work that well when you kind of press on them in certain situations.
Have you ever wondered, wait, how does Andrew know about all of the new LGBTQ literature, TV, and film in society? Well, I have a secret tool and it's called the Gay and Lesbian Review. It is my favorite magazine. It is bi-monthly, which means it comes out every 2 months. So right now, the March and April issue just came out. It's an encore issue. It's called When Did the LGBT Movement Begin? There's such exciting articles about what made Stonewall different, a sacred order for sexual outsiders, the house that Hirschfeld built, and so much more in that issue. I actually just had on authors William Benneman, Margaret Vandenberg, and Lawrence Senelik, who had written to me, and I discuss his responses as a special gay and lesbian review and ITBR podcast episode. So you can look for that in our podcast catalog. It is all about the January and February issue called Strange Fruits. So I can't wait for you all to listen to that. I absolutely love all of the queer history, culture, politics that the Gay and Lesbian Review covers. I love getting my print magazine. It just is so nostalgic having a magazine arrive at my door. But they also have an extensive online edition, so you can get the magazine online. I know so many in my life who've told me that they are now reading the Gay and Lesbian Review for LGBTQ literature recommendations. I love that. So you can use an exclusive code. Stephen from the Gay and Lesbian Review and Richard gave me an exclusive code to share with you all. It is called ITBR Choice. So ITBR Choice. Go to subscribe on the glreview.org. Put in that code ITBR Choice, and you will get a free issue with your subscription. So all you'll have to do is where it says what magazine do you want for free, just put March and April or January and February. And I can't wait for you all to get your hands on the Gay and Lesbian Review. Make sure you follow them on Instagram. And please let me know if you're reading the Gay and Lesbian Review because I'd love to shout you out on the podcast. So you all know that I am such a fan of musical theater and classic movies. So I can't wait for you all to listen to one of my good friends' podcasts. It's called That Old Gay Classic Cinema, hosted by Christian Garcia. It's a podcast that looks at classic cinema films that we know and love. And he was inspired by Turner Classic Movies and The Great Movie Ride. Remember that amazing ride where the Wicked Witch of the West rose up in a burst of flame in Disney? That was one of my favorite rides. I'm so sad it closed. So, while looking at classic films, Christian is so excited to look at it with a queer lens. And he brings on friends like myself to talk about all of these films. I was on the first episode when we discussed The Sound of Music. I've been on an episode of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. He just released an episode about the Philadelphia story. He's done Meet Me in St. Louis, Sweet Charity, Psycho, Mary Poppins, Hello Dolly. He had on Down the Yellow Brick Road hosts and the Garland Gab hosts to talk about The Wizard of Oz. So make sure that you listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema on Apple and Spotify and follow him on TikTok and Instagram at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Okay, start watching the classic movies and make sure you listen to Christian's podcast. Well, and I love like returning earlier when you had this argument about like author societies that like the changing landscape instead of valorizing or holding an author as a martyr. Like that's something that I saw like doing um my dissertation on Whitman, and like it was even some tension I had within those in Whitman studies is like there's a certain faction, and I think it's in any author studies. It happens in Poe, Melville, Wharton, like we could just name them off, but it's almost as if you can't question um their place in history. But like my point was always instead of like valorizing their biography, why don't we take like what happens in Benito Cereno or take what happens in the proliferation of whiteness among the Pequod and like the whiteness of the whale. Like the whale is white. And that's why Toni Morrison, and I will always say Playing in the Dark is one of my favorite essays ever.
Me too.
Um, is right. And it's that whole subversive analysis, which is, well, the whiteness is exactly what is racialized. Like black bodies don't have to be racialized in a text in order for black bodies to be evoked.
Absolutely.
Um, right? So,
Yeah.
do you feel that that is something there still is like this traditional mindset that you're even coming against or have to work through with your own work? Or do you think that the landscape in literary studies has shifted so much that, you're able to like have so many creative opportunities and the terrain is there for you?
I think it one thing that I found when I was writing this book that I really had to struggle with was I wanted to bring together authors and texts that generally aren't read in conjunction. So, people like Poe, you don't often read him alongside Harriet Jacobs or Hannah Crafts or Charles Ball, um, and so it was hard because those two those are they belong in our the way that our academy is segmented. Those people belong in different traditions and in different areas of expertise, and those areas of expertise have ways of talking to one another. And so it was hard to figure out how to bring those areas together and talk to both at the same time, or more than one at the same time, um, without losing part of my readership. And I think that does have to do with the traditions that you're talking about. I mean, I hope, and I do think that we've moved away from this traditional author society model. And I do think that, people are relaxing those ways of thinking. Um, but they're still sort of like, they have a legacy. They're not gone completely, even if individuals are no longer policing things in the way that they used to, that the legacy is still there. And so it just takes time to sort of like talk across field divides. And I hope that I'm able to do that a little bit with this book by bringing these people in conversation, and they would have all read one another. That's the thing, like um, when, Frederick Douglass is incredibly well read, and he would be reading all sorts of people, and to bring him out of that conversation distorts the way that we understand the text themselves.
Well, it sounds like my argument for why I brought in Oscar Wilde or Victorianism into Whitman is because Whitman and Wilde met each other, and like the cross Atlantic exchange is so strong in the 19th century. Like, right, with
Yeah,
Poe, you have
absolutely.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Poe
Yeah,
communicating. And right, Poe even from what I remember, is inspired so much by Elizabeth Barrett Browning's style that he
yeah,
even tries to mimic it in The Raven,
absolutely. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and but like you're saying, it's hard if you're talking about Whitman and Wilde to bring those fields together because everybody's trained in such a
Mhm.
specific way, and you have to figure that out. But I do think that um, you know, people are moving a little bit more toward collaboration these days, and there's some really amazing work happening when a British scholar and an Americanist scholar will work together, or people from different time periods will work together. So I hope that our field is going to be more open to that in the future.
Yeah, well, and that whole interdisciplinary approach, I think, is so like I'm so inspired talking with you. Not only that you're, going to be the sole editor of Post Studies, like it's in very good hands, but
Oh, thank
it is exciting to hear just your approach because it's like a sigh of relief of okay, there's all models, like even with Post Studies like having a film critic bring in the new Netflix series, like, or
Mm,
even how Poe has been imagined in opera, or, all of these iterations. That
absolutely.
all is scholarship, right? If there was a Poe, video game, like that's something to bear.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Podcasts,
Yeah.
it's, bringing these worlds together. I think it is all happening right now. It's, just like you said, realizing that we're in collaboration and not in competition with each other. And maybe that is the difference between the traditionalist mindset was, I have to be the sole sighted person and like, can't bring other scholars with me. It has to just be my own voice and this is my own niche that I, only analyze Usher and I only analyze family decay and the
Right.
aristocracy, right? Like that's a very
Right.
specific like dissertation. Um, but like to turn to the other black girl, because like you brought us to the publishing house, which I agree with you, was so um fruitful, but like that paranoia is so akin to academia.
Mm.
It like reminds me of The Devil Wears Prada, of like Miranda Priestley and Anna Wintour's um mythology that's been created, whether true or not. It's a paranoia that people understand. Um, what surprised you about like just diving into the other black girl? Like, was it what you expected when you like first started?
No, I had no idea what to expect. I haven't read the book. I'd heard about it. It had been on my list to read, and I just hadn't gotten to it. But I was very surprised, and I was actually really interested in how much it had in common with one of the books I write about in my book called "The Bondwoman's Narrative" by Hannah
Mm,
Crafts. Um, Hannah Crafts in that narrative, as it was a manuscript. It was never published in the until the 21st century actually, but it was a fictional narrative that we now know was written by an enslaved woman named Hannah Bond, and she writes about this protagonist named Hannah who's enslaved, and Hannah over the course of the narrative forms all these bonds of friendship and intimacy with women, and white women, or one woman turns out not to be white, but she thinks she's white. And so Hannah is enslaved, and she's trying to like negotiate her place in 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 an enslaved society by forming friendships with white women who she wants to protect her and maybe even purchase her and give her a better life than she has with her current enslaver. And so that novel is all about friendship, female friendship. And but it's seen through this lens of um, profit and spying, and kind of it's a critique of using friendship to get ahead in the world, or like trying to have intimacy in order to be successful on the terms that you've set out for yourself. So it just really, like, the black girl, the other black girl, really struck me with the criticism of capitalism and the way that people, the characters in the show, are struggling with the compromises they have to make in order to fit into the model of racist, white supremacist capitalism. Um, and that these Black woman characters are harming themselves in such dramatic ways because they're trying to succeed in this capitalist system. Um, so yeah, I saw the parallels there in the ways that both texts treat feminism and women's friendships and a capitalist structure.
Yeah, and it's what I thought does so well, right? Is Zakiya Dalila Harris's novel. For everyone, right? If you want to like read it first, or in my case, like you, I'm going to read it after. And I think like my mom read it and she told me it is a she hasn't seen the show, but it does seem like it diverges, of course,
Mhm.
from the TV series. But um like I was instantly reminded of like its critique of modern liberalism, and I thought it
Mhm.
was a real, just like Get Out, like a wrench turning um look at white people who think they're allies but really are causing so much harm
Yep.
thinking that they're being allies, like Vera, and just what was happening with her in the beginning, and um like Richard Wagner's thinking he is really opening up diverse voices, but um is manipulating black women against each other, like who's going to be the tokenized person. It was like how Diana plays a role as the author and all of that. First, I'm a Beverly Hills Housewife fan, and I forgot Garcelle Bouvet plays Diana. Like I thought she was incredible in that role.
Yeah.
Like all the acting, I just really enjoyed
Yeah.
their camaraderie.
Mhm.
But yeah, what is like the whole what you're bringing to bear with Hannah Crafts, I think is so interesting because Harriet Jacobs, I just remember how much Harriet Jacobs always appeals to white women. It's
Mhm.
like, aren't you crying now after hearing this? And like what was that whole like for those listening, Kelly, like why was Harriet Jacobs, in your opinion, like what was that appeal to white women? Like, because it is a convention that happens a lot in antebellum
Sure.
literature.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, she knows her readership. I mean, a lot of slave narratives are being distributed in order to change the hearts and minds of white women. Um, and then, according to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the white women will change the hearts and minds of the white men, and the white men are the ones who have the vote and the political power. So, through the women is the path to victory eventually. So, Jacobs is, like most enslaved narrators or ex-slave narrators, knows that their readership will be white primarily, and a lot of women readers. And so they're specifically speaking to those readers in order to make change, in order to encourage them to become abolitionists. But Jacobs, I mean, there's reasons why certain narratives are the ones that we come back to and teach out of the hundreds that we have to choose from. We choose Jacobs and Douglas and some others. Jacobs is so canny and so sharp in her language. And so she's both appealing to the women and saying, like, we're both women, but you can't imagine what it's like to be a Black woman. um yes, you know what it's like to be a mother. We both know what it's like to be a mother, but that's where our identity ends. and you have laws to protect the sanctity of your home. Enslaved women don't. And so she's very shrewd in the way that she's both appealing to and distancing from, in order to, you know, activate sympathy. But at the same time, I think also just she's very frustrated with the way that she's treated, and that sharpness comes through in the novel, or excuse me, the narrative.
When I think about this sponsor for the podcast, I always just think of coziness. There is such a cozy aesthetic with Broadview Press. If you've never heard of Broadview Press, they are an independent publisher. They publish books like the new edition of The Wizard of Oz, The Great Gatsby, Dracula, all of your classic literary canon. But they don't just publish classic books, they also publish anthologies. So I just had the pleasure of meeting the editors of the Vampire Literature Anthology. If you are a Gothic fan, if you love the history of vampires, Nosferatu, uh, you are going to love this anthology. You don't have to be a college instructor or even a college student to enjoy Broadview Press's books. For example, the vampire literature book has so many different literary examples of just where the vampire pops up in our zeitgeist of pop culture. Another book that I absolutely love is The Philosophy of Sports. I'm sure so many of you out there listening know someone who's obsessed with sports. Did you know that there's a whole investigative philosophy about why people are drawn to sporting culture, why there are die-hard fans? I'm looking at you, Philadelphia Eagles. I can say that because I'm from the Philly area originally. Anyone else not from the Philly area, we're going to give you a side eye. But Broadview Press just is so incredible with their books that they're always publishing. I love talking to Dylan, who works at Broadview Press, and Dylan always sends me copies of new books that have come out. So I know all about a new book called Everyday Ethics, which you definitely have to look into if you're interested in philosophy. But I also love that there's a collection of Victorian literature, American literature. If you have just been really interested in a genre, like you just love fairy tales, then you need to get their Folks and Fairy Tales anthology. So, Broadview Press has been so kind to give a promotion code for all of you listening to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Ready? Write it down. Put it in your phone right now. It is ITBR20. So you get 20% off all of your Broadview Press books. Any book that you get is 20% off. BroadviewPress.com. Please let me know what you're getting from Broadview Press. I'd love to share it on our social media. And make sure you follow them on Instagram at Broadview Press. Enjoy your reading. Well, and I'm glad you brought up Harriet Beecher Stowe, because I remember when I read Uncle Tom's Cabin as an undergrad, it was like in my capstone course. I was so frustrated with Uncle Tom's Cabin. I think it's because I had already like dug into the slave narratives and like Harriet
Sure.
Jacobs' openness, or just like you've said, the way that she really understands her audience and is positioning herself, but also realizing there's only so much um agency and freedom she has in her voice. Where like Harriet Beecher Stowe, I feel, does this maudlin, carnivalesque mockery a la blackface. Like it is troubling. Like, even though I recognize though how she's trying to appeal to, end slavery and like show the agency of enslaved people. I mean, how do you weigh in on that? Because right, like I know I'm having a modern day critique, but I
No,
do
no.
think the portrayal of the dialect of African Americans, like showing them, like even using Uncle Tom as this stereotype,
Yeah.
isn't like what Harriet Jacobs is doing at all.
No, and actually Harriet Jacobs uses dialect for the poor whites and not for the enslaved people. So yeah. No, I get what you're saying, absolutely. And I think this idea of like whether a white writer should be portraying Black characters. That's something that my students are very invested in discussing, especially in the last 5 years or so. We talk about that a lot, and I think they're really smart about thinking through the issues around that and the benefits as well as the drawbacks. But one interesting thing is that even if it's a Black writer writing about Black characters, it's still being filtered through whiteness often at a certain level. Because, for example, with slave narratives, antebellum slave narratives, those are usually being circulated by abolitionist societies, anti-slavery societies, which tend to be mostly white. And a lot of enslaved people were narrating their stories to white amanuenses, or Lydia Mariah Child, a white editor, is editing Jacobs's narrative. So there's all sorts of ways, even when it is a Black author, that author's voice is still being filtered through whiteness. And you see that in the other Black girl as well, right? I mean, Diana Gordon has a Black editor, but then I don't know if we're allowed to give spoilers. Should I not spoil it?
Yeah, you can give a
Oh,
spoiler. That's fine. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
So it's a Black writer with a Black editor. They have an ending that they both want, and then Wagner says no. The white editor in chief, head of the publishing house, changes the ending to a ending that will be suitable for white readers. So, I think one thing I try and impress on my students is that it's never so simple as like a person writing a character of the same race as themselves is more authentic or is absolutely authentic, because even that characterization has gone through filters and is still a product of white supremacist systems in all sorts of ways. Um, so yeah, but it's definitely something that we talk a lot about, and I think students are really thoughtful about it, especially because a lot of my students at Rider are creative writers themselves, and so I think they're really thinking about like, what does it mean for me? If I'm white or if I'm Latino, can I write a Black character? Can I write a white character? So it'll be, yeah, I mean, you see that with the sensitivity reader in the other Black girl as well, right? Like we have right now the sort of system in place is sensitivity readers, but I wonder kind of going forward what will happen with that, and will we need sensitivity readers, or will people just kind of start to understand the problems and not police themselves, but maybe like think it through more um, carefully before they write or publish the book.
Yeah, well, and it's so interesting because like you're making me think of even the power of Alice Walker's novel is that Celie is writing. Like the agency really is coming through her act of writing and reading and always appealing to God in her journals. Like almost every entry is Dear God. Like, or eventually she has Dear Nettie, like when she's writing to her sister. But like that act was taken away from those who were enslaved. Like, and The Color Purple, right, opens up new the dynamic between like African American men who are landowners now and like the violence against women, right? And I know Alice Walker faced a lot of backlash from, the Black community, like who said, you're portraying us in a certain way. But thank goodness that that novel exists because it's had so many iterations.
Mm.
And I feel like the other Black girl, like Delilah Harris, is like continuing this even more of the nuances of whose voice, like who gets to talk, right? Like Phyllis Wheatley as a poet had to testify in a court with white men. So like there was the legal system, and then like it's like you said, there's still a legacy that will it continues. But like what did you think of Colin? I mean, that whole farce. But it wasn't a farce, right? Because we
No,
know
right.
that that
Of
exists in
course
the
not. Yeah.
workplace. They're
Yeah.
like, oh no, we have to protect his feelings. Like you
Right.
can't, he gives us all of this money. It reminds me of foundations.
Yeah.
But but they'll throw that person out when the shit hits the fan.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah, no,
very interesting.
it was, and I do think that the show is interesting in I mean, publishing is such a white industry. It's still so white. And that has a lot to do with the way that publishing relies on internships, and you can't take an unpaid internship if you are struggling economically. You know, if you don't have the privilege of being able to live without an income for 6 months, you're not going to be able to take an unpaid internship, and that's going to make it very hard to break into publishing. And so it is still an industry, right? And they talk in the show about his feelings. Vera presents it at first as, we don't want to hurt Colin's feelings, and it's all about feelings. But then very quickly, that feelings layer gets stripped away, and it is actually the bottom line. And so, you know, it's like, he's our bestseller. He pays for everything. We can't afford to lose him. Um, and that's what I like best about the show, is the critique of capitalism and the way
Mhm.
that it deals with all sorts of microaggressions in the workplace, like Sophie, like Vera, like you mentioned. There are all those microaggressions, but it's within this system that's constituted by capitalism. And so I think the show is showing these microaggressions and playing them for humor a little bit, and then within, or expanding out from that, to say it's not the microaggressions alone that's the problem, it's the structure that's holding these microaggressions in place. And that is publishing reproducing its whiteness. And that is because of the economic conditions that allow certain already privileged people to go into this industry and keep others out of that industry. Um, if there were more people of color at Wagner Books, they would have noticed, and they would have noticed that Chartricia is not a good character, and they would have, they wouldn't have tried to bury the sensitivity read. But it's economics that's making that the case. It's not about feelings; it's actually about class and work structures.
Yeah. Well, and like their whole approach to having Nella there at Wagner, and like Wagner even like continuing to coddle her as the token employee. But once she has her own view and opinion, how squashed that is. It reminds me of like press releases from uh universities where like you can tell whether they actually are supporting diverse and equitable work, or if it's just like, oh, we've hired someone like because of their background, but we really are not investing in the work they're doing. And
Exactly.
it's so relatable. Like that was something in the series, is even with like the magical escapism, like which is how I'll like categorize the other elements of the plot.
Mhm.
I felt like that escapism, though, was even just lending the pressure of trying to fit um, in that supremacist capitalist society you've
Right.
talked about. But you also want to try to build this bridge with your own community and bring them into the fold, even though the system's against you.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what I saw in the parallel that I was making with Hannah Crafts, because in the end, Hannah, excuse me, the protagonist of the novel, um, she tries to fit in. She tries to work within the system. She's not trying to run away from enslavement. She's staying within the system of enslavement, but just trying to negotiate for better conditions. And then finally, she gets this enslaver, this woman, Mrs. Wheeler, who, interestingly, there's a blackface episode in there with a skin powder that also reminded me of this show with the hair grease, like the way that
Mhm.
these skin products and cosmetic products are have symbolic resonance in all sorts of ways. But so Hannah's purchased by Mrs. Wheeler. Mrs. Wheeler is such a cruel enslaver that Hannah can't even stand the system anymore. She just gives up on negotiating within the system and decides to run away. And it's when she runs away, and she escapes to New Jersey, actually. She gets the author Hannah Crafts gives her this absolute wish fulfillment ending, where she like reunites with her mother. She finds her all these kind people. She gets married. It's just this beautiful wish fulfillment. And it's yeah, that's what literature can do with, like you were saying, the magical escapism, right? That um the first part of the novel is very like realistic and or not realistic, but critical and open-eyed about the conditions of enslavement. And then the end is totally escapist.
Yeah.
And in this, there's all sorts of absolutely in the other Black girl, there's all sorts of really realistic things that happen in a workplace, and the ways that Black women are treated. And then you also have this very symbolic, magical escapist plot going on at the same time.
Yeah, it's like it's showing me how like daring Nella Larson was with passing, like
Yes,
actually having her character fall out the balcony and die because it is such a um well, do you feel like going back to Poe, like Poe was able to take chances like in terms of the Gothic and having these macabre themes because of his race positionality compared to say like it's taken like generations for authors of color to have those types of daring voices or characters because of the realities of the publishing world.
that is such a great question. Yeah, I would want to think more about that because Poe too was so poor
Mm.
that I mean, yes, absolutely, he had the privilege of whiteness and maleness. Um, but he was working so hard to just earn enough money to feed himself and his family, that I always think of him as having less freedom than someone like Hawthorne or
Mm.
um, I don't know, uh, Edith Wharton, for example, right?
Yes, yeah.
But and Poe is writing in genres where that sort of ridiculous, over the top sensationalism was expected. Um, but I do think what you're saying about on the other side of it, the people, authors of color being so restricted in so many ways, by the conditions of publishing, that is something that I can see. I think there's always exceptions to that, of course, and Douglas is a great exception. The way that he keeps rewriting his autobiography, getting more and more control over the story he wants to tell, and you know, changing the way that he shapes his narrative. Um, but certainly the first version of his autobiography is very conditioned by the expectations of other people and the pressures of, white people, for example.
Yeah. Well, and just because he was my undergrad mentor, I have to shout out, and he's been on the podcast, John Cullen Gruser, Dr. Gruser.
Yeah.
Um, and he's worked so much on Pauline Hopkins. Like, talk about daring and detective fiction, like what she did with her narratives. Um, in that time, I find are like she really took a lot of risks and chances. And I think a lot of her writing was published in newspapers. So like it was serialized,
Yeah.
which is also interesting to see the sensational plots that happen when a work is serialized, and everyone's waiting for the next issue. But yeah, like, our time has gone by so quick, Kelly, but you're gonna have to come back on again.
I would love
Definitely.
to.
Um,
After I
but
watch Usher.
yes, after you watch Usher, there we go. Um, like I am curious, like when we're ending, an author who's just like the other Black girl, I really feel like Toni Morrison's voice was very palpable. Like I was just thinking, like, of course, with Diana writing this bestseller, I was just thinking of like all of the Black female authors who in America broke so much ground, like a Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, even like Angela Davis.
Mhm.
Um, like Toni Morrison's Beloved is a ghost story.
Oh my gosh,
Um,
yeah.
but how do you weigh in our culture right now? Like, could you have imagined that Beloved? I mean, it was always challenged, but it's like back to the banning of books conversation. But like, why is say Poe's, um, Legia
Yeah,
or the Mask of the Red Death, which has all of this torture? Why is that not under the scrutiny of banning books?
yeah.
Like, so what's happening, you think, in the public's appetite for banning certain topics right now?
That's such a great point. And I love that contrast between Poe and Morrison. And Morrison, of course, writes about Poe in Playing in the Dark, which, as we both said, is our favorite. So I think Morrison knew that she was um, in conversation with Poe in Beloved. Um, yeah, I mean, it's not the ghost story part of it, I think, that people are responding to or banning. It's that people are afraid of telling the truth about American history, which is that Americans have always been have always exploited and oppressed people, and that those legacies live on and continue to shape our society. And I mean, that's what Beloved is about. The ghost is the ghost of slavery, the ghost of violence and racial violence and sexual violence. And people don't want to admit that about America. They want to have this little happy narrative of, you know, America, the land of the free. And certainly Beloved doesn't fit in with that. I don't think Poe does either, though. So if anyone read his books, I think they would probably need to ban them as well. But I guess they're just not actually reading them.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point because the topics that he delves into, or even a Moby Dick delves into, or the Scarlet Letter, I mean, it's about
Right.
adultery, right?
Right. You'd have to
Um,
ban pretty much everything.
yeah, but I think it's also like issues around sexuality, and like we could have a part two. Like definitely, I think if you came back and talked about gender and sexuality, like we're only like touching the surface because Harriet Jacobs, what she does with sexuality, like talk about daring when she actually
Yes.
talks about queerness. Like that's something like Poe doesn't do. Like he's not open around queerness in that
Yeah.
sense. So it
Although
is
I
interesting.
I
Yeah.
loved your conversation with Paul Jones and David Grevin about
Oh,
Poe and queerness. That was so great. So, and I think Paul's reading of his most recent book is so wonderful on Poe and queer futures.
yeah. Well, and like I've like, presented and I'm like, it's a work in progress after my conference presentation. But I mean, I think with Poe, there's so much suggestive, like the interstices of queerness
Mm,
is all there in my mind in terms
mhm.
of like narcissism and Freudian elements happening in Usher and like who is the narrator. And we don't know a lot about his origin story with Roderick. So yeah, queerness is there. I think just the directness, I'll
Yeah,
put it, with like a Harriet Jacobs or even what Alice Walker does with queer women and love
yeah,
and beloved and queerness. Like there's queerness with, the beloved world too.
sure. Or
Um
Audre Lorde, or yeah, tons of people. Absolutely.
exactly. Like I think that like that could be a whole other conversation, which is how like an already marginalized group like further takes daring risks in
Sure.
the face of knowing that they're going to be put under scrutiny for it by
Mm,
the public. So, yeah, I
absolutely.
mean, I'm giving them kudos,
Yeah,
basically, giving them their
absolutely.
flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so Kelly, how can everyone out there, find out more about you? I mean, we have your writer profile linked.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's probably the best way. I think my email's on there. It's kross@rider.edu. And yeah, I'd love to chat with people about race and surveillance and Poe and whatever else. So please get in touch.
Oh, good. Okay. And is there any specific like social media you would love people to follow you at, or
Um,
you're off the
I
grid?
I run the post studies social media very
Okay.
badly, but it's not actually my own personal. But if people are interested in Poe, please follow the Poe studies. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky and and Threads. Yeah, so Poe
Oh,
studies.
great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone who's interested in Poe, we've had a Fall of the House of Usher episode that would have it just came out, so listen to that
Oh,
before
okay.
listening to, listen to that if you haven't. So follow Poe Studies, look at, Dr. Kelly Ross's writer profile, get your hands on her book. Kelly, this has been a pleasure. Thank you
Oh,
so
what
much
a
for
pleasure.
coming
Yes.
on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, can't wait to have you back again. Part two.
Absolutely. Okay, great. I can't
Okay,
wait.
bye everyone out there. Bye, Kelly.